Um, Welcome to week 5. It's hard to believe that we're already halfway through the course. Hopefully, you've been enjoying it so far. And now the fun part starts. We got to work on group projects and build up toward the demo. Um, the demo is going to come around pretty quickly. So it happens week 8, which only gives us about 3 more weeks to develop the project before the demo day. So just keep that in mind when you're kind of thinking about what to do, what to accomplish. It's good to be ambitious, but also keep in mind that there are time constraints, and so you want to plan around that as well. Remember that the assignment for this week is due Wednesday before lab. Um, so it's mainly just planning, right? Just planning out user stories, the GitHub repo. If the group that had trouble, talk to me after and we'll discuss. Um, One key thing to emphasize again is demo-centric planning. So maybe it's good to think about what the long-term vision is for your application, right? If you had a lot of time and a lot of resources, what would the grand vision look like? And then maybe think about what you could practice and what you could build just for the demo, right? So if the grand vision is really big, maybe you want to build just a section of that for the demo and show that it works and show that it has functionality. And then you can talk about what the next steps are. That could be a neat way to kind of work on something a little smaller and make sure it gets finished, but then still have a bigger vision. That's also really cool. But don't also sell yourself too short. Don't do too little and then think that it'll work. Still make sure you do enough to showcase awesome parts of the app. So that's due this week, and make sure you submit it through here. That's great. And then let's talk a little bit about the lab. So last week we did JavaScript and Ajax, right? So we send asynchronous JavaScript. And let me pull up the lab recap. So we did basic, right? We did a basic chat where we had messages, right? And you would basically refresh and try to get the messages back without having to actually reload the page. So hopefully everyone got through working with messages as a data model, right? The stuff we've done before, it's trying to get a little more complex, trying to map out our idea of the data to active record models. So starting to think, about nested resources and nested routes. We've done this before, but it's always kind of interesting to see about, how it plays out in each scenario. And so here we have chat rooms. We have messages that belong to rooms. So we had a nested resource, right? The messages belong to the room, and here we had the room as a reference. So milestone 2 was pretty straightforward, the kind of stuff we've done before, right? Setting up the chat, adding in a form 4, and this is for a nested resource. So we're trying to hit the URL, right? Room/room ID/message. Users can join rooms. Users can send messages. We're using paths, right? So it's stuff we've seen before. 3 was also something that we kind of worked with before, using sessions, right, for authentication. We didn't use Devise for this one. If you're going to use authentication for your group projects, I would recommend using Devise. It provides a lot of functionality that we've kind of already learned. But you also don't have to. If the application is trying to encourage people to get in and start quickly, you don't need a full-fledged authentication. And this was one example of just basic sign-in with an email, and then you have that session saved for the user. Milestone 4 was where people started to face some difficulty. So we had polling changes in JSON, right? So in the lecture, we had, let me pull it up here, we had a controller, and we had respond to HTML and the JS, right? And so if we have respond to JS, for example, we would have an index.js.erb file, right? So this file is a JavaScript file, but it's also an embedded Ruby, so we can use the Ruby helpers like this. So calling in, JavaScript, and J, remember, stands for escape JavaScript. So it takes HTML and escapes it, so you can send it as a web request. If you try to send just plain HTML, the client won't know how to render it. Do you mind grabbing? The client won't know how to render it, so we got to escape it. So you can do J. You also can do escape JavaScript. Same thing. So in the controller, right, if you have JS, it'll look for an index.js.erb. You also can send back JSON, and a lot of companies are starting to use this with a rich kind of framework on the front end. So if you're using mobile apps or React or Angular, a lot of companies use Ruby on Rails just as a JSON store, essentially, or a JSON server. So you can send back format.json, and here you don't actually need to specify a different file. You can say, go ahead and render JSON. You can call @messages to JSON, and that'll return @messages in a JSON array. So that starts to make it pretty handy as well. So in the example here, right, this one responds to the 3 different types of requests. The normal HTML view that we've seen before, JavaScript, which is useful for asynchronous requests. If you send a remote request, right, you're not expecting an immediate answer. You're expecting a result that comes back not as a view, but instead as JavaScript. And also you can respond to JSON. So that was part of milestone 4. And one tricky part was we were defining the function not in an ERB file, but in messages.json. So you kind of had to do some tricky stuff to get the room ID. You could pass it in as a parameter and then use it here. Some people were clever and decided to use the location, the URL. So you could do window.location.href, and that'll start to show you the URL, and you can get the ID from there. Or you could hard code it in and just say, room ID is 10 for now, and see what happens. But that's one thing to know is when you don't have those Ruby helpers, you got to kind of think about how you get your access to your variables. There's an AJAX function, getJSON. It's similar to AJAX get. It just automatically defaults to JSON. And in the lecture, we did an HTML.erb file, allowing us to use Rails helpers. We talked about that. Milestone 5 was now polling changes with JavaScript. So just another way of doing a similar concept, right? Rather than getting results back in JSON, we'll get the result back as a JavaScript file, and that'll execute and then run when it returns to us. So here it's asking us, right, for a format.js file, which is similar to what we did in the lecture. It asks you to find a separate function, and you can call jQuery.getScript, which is the similar function to getJSON just for the JavaScript side, and it returns back. This time you don't have to handle the response, right? So if you get back a JSON request, the client needs to understand how to deal with that and how to show that information to the user. If you get back a JavaScript file, right, what's the difference? The difference is the JavaScript file already contains all the logic that it should need to update the view. So the client then doesn't need any logic. It doesn't need to handle the response. It just needs to get the response, and that's enough. So with milestone 5, very similar. We had another function. And again, notice here the difference is, so in the JSON, we had to get the response and add it to the view. So we had some functionality here to append it to the HTML. And the JS, we don't have to because the JS file, as you can see here, already contains the necessary JavaScript to modify the view, in which case we simply just have to call and get that response. Finally, for those who were able to rocket through the first part, a little bit was about ActionCable, which was an introduction to WebSockets, and we'll talk about that today. But it basically did just a basic front-end connection to the server and setting in a WebSocket. But don't worry if you didn't get there because that's what we're talking about today. So that was Lab 4 recap. Hopefully that makes sense. Working with asynchronous JavaScript, right, sending requests. One thing we kind of touched upon just briefly was adding in remote true to requests, like a form for or form tag, right? If you add in remote true, we'll look up the API here, but it essentially doesn't expect a response back immediately. So here is the guide to Ajax, and you notice, right, it's use unobtrusive JavaScript, and we'll see here that you can add in, so form width, I believe, is, I see that, is automatically defaults to Ajax. So when it generates the HTML, data remote equals true. And when you add in remote true to request, it doesn't expect back an HTML view. It instead expects back an asynchronous request, so either JS or JSON. And that sometimes makes for a more pleasing user experience, right? If you're not having to sit there and wait for the request to come back, if you want to update in the background, remote true is a good resource for that. So something just to think about with your projects as well, how to make it so that the background can automatically refresh. And we saw how we set up in the lecture. We use set interval to set up a poll, right? So every 10 seconds, every 5 seconds, we ask for some more data. That's definitely one way of doing things. But today we're going to cover WebSockets. So let's get to WebSockets. And I'll update these links at the end of the lecture. So zoom in here. Cool. So that was last week. Let me get into this week. And okay, so uh, we are working with, cool. So let me see if I can just run the Rails server and see if we can get basic application going. So for this week, for the demo, we're going to do a very similar concept. We're going to work with a chat application. It's kind of a good way to kind of think about how to do WebSockets. But last week, right, we had to pull. So the front end had to ask every so often for an update. This week, we're going to register ourselves and create a WebSocket, which is a connection. And the server is going to pass down to the client information about when the information has been updated. So let's see if we can get, great. So we have here just a basic room with some chats. And let me first talk about WebSockets at a high level. So let's go through ActionCable. So WebSockets was incorporated in Rails 5. Before that, it was a standalone gem, and you could kind of have different options. But with Rails 5, they decided to incorporate it, and so it comes default under ActionCable. And it uses a publishing subscription pub/sub protocol. Who here has worked with pub/sub before? Okay. So right, a typical HTTP request is initiated from the person calling. So you send either a GET or a POST or a PATCH, right? And it's a single request. The request goes to the server, and the server responds back with an answer, and that's the complete lifecycle of an HTTP. But with publish and subscribe, you just have to register yourself. So the client registers itself with the server, and that's the end of that process. And anytime there's an update, the server pushes it back to the client. And that connection can stay open for a period of time. It can stay open forever. So it's important to think about the memory footprint, the performance, because when you have a connection that's open forever, if you start to take up a lot of memory, that won't get collected over time, and that could add in. So in Rails, we have ActionCable, which is a way to handle our WebSockets. There's a few different concepts to cover. So there's a connection, and a connection is the protocol that exists between the client and the server. So whenever you open up a new WebSocket, there will be a connection that exists between the client and the server. There could be multiple connections between the client and the server. Each connection just represents the data flow between the client and the server. And how is a connection used? Well, there's a channel. So in WebSockets in Rails 5, a channel encapsulates like a topic. So a channel is something that you want to subscribe to. Once you subscribe to the channel, you get all of its messages. The messages are passed via the connection. So the channel kind of creates a connection and keeps that connection open. And the connection is what actually handles the data flow between the two units. But the user, you don't ever really interact with the connection from a code level. You interact with the channel. So instead, you can push messages to the channel, and then the messages can push those out to all of its subscribers. And there's different ways of setting it up, and in all the documentation, it's pretty handy. There's also a lot of great resources that walk through how to set up some of these channels and connections, which is great if you ever have questions about it. So when you create a channel, you subscribe to it, and so you want to define some logic and some code around the subscription process. When someone signs up, how do they actually subscribe for that information? And then once they've signed up, you start to talk more about the client side, right? So how do you push notifications from the server down to the client? And so here's where we start to use that connection. And you have a stream, and the stream will push data from the server down to the client, and it'll do that in a broadcasting. So there's no other way to specify send information to just one client. When you send information through the channel, anyone who subscribed to that channel gets the information. So it's a one-to-many sort of protocol. It gets broadcast out to everyone. There's a lot you can do with it. You can rebroadcast a message. So that's kind of how kind of the terminology of ActionCable, right? We have channels, we have connections, we have a subscription, which is an individual connection to a channel. You start to see kind of how these terms kind of are mapped to maybe different types of use cases. Right, similar, we have active record, we have models. Right, with ActionCable, we have channels, connections, and subscriptions. I also want to walk through. Yeah, that's the high level. Anything else here? I want to do rebroadcasting. These are just examples. Okay. So this is the action cable, and we're going to get started with our walkthrough. So we have our Rails server, and like it's up and running. We have some rooms. Let's go ahead and start over from the top, actually. So we'll create a room. I'll create a room called Ruby3, and I'll sign up with my name and message hello world, and let's see what happens. Great. Okay, so here we have a basic application setup. We have different rooms, and we have messages, and we have users. So those are our three models: right? Rooms, messages, and users. Very similar to last week. You can add into a room, and once you're part of the room, you can start to see the messages that come to that room, and you can also see the person who sends that messages. And right now, it says online users is just me. Let's see if we can get you guys on. And this is the fun part. This is where we start to get interactive today. So I'm going to say Rails server, and I'm going to bind myself to a specific port. And I'm going to So I'm going to be up and running. Let's see, great. And let's see if I can get my IP address. So if config, it's way too big. All right, let's get this guy. Can you guys see that? This one? Can you guys try going there, see what happens? So if you try to go to that one, I believe port 3000. You should be able to get there. Can you guys see it? One 192.168.3.16. Try going there HTTP to that address and then port 3000. Oh. So it looks like we got some users. Can anyone else get in? Yeah. Oops. Oh. So you'll notice here that actually that the other user section, right? Information starts to populate here without actually having to do anything. And that's because this component has already been set up to use Websockets. So it registers a connection, it subscribes to a channel, and it starts to show up. So without having to do anything, right? We're sitting here, people are logging in, we're starting to get information here. But you'll notice that the messages don't actually populate, right? You have to refresh, and once you refresh, oh, hey, there's a bunch of messages, right? So the other users part has been set up with WebSockets, but the messages right now, there's nothing there. It's just on refresh, it loads all the messages and shows them. So the goal of today's lecture is going to be to use WebSockets to showcase the messages here and kind of walk through and talk about how that process works. And so by the end of the lecture, we should have it set up so that when you type in a new message, right, it shows up for me, but it doesn't show up for you guys. And you have to refresh in order to see the information. So this is where we're at. This is where we're going to start. Let's walk through a little bit of the code here. So we'll delete out that. Now that everyone's in. Great. And you'll see here the server is busy transmitting to everyone. Cool. So let's start looking at our code. So we have our messages controller. And is this the right? Yeah. Okay. So we have very similar. We have an index. We have create functionality, a response to HTML, a response to JavaScript. We have some models, so we'll pull them up here. Right? We have a few. We have a message model, which is very basic, just a body and a username, right, to the person sending it and the messages you want to send. We have rooms, which we subscribe to, and rooms have many messages, which we'll see here, right, and which already taught. And finally, there's a user, So it has a user as a username, so we can keep track of who's sending messages, kind of persistence. So how right now does a message get added in? Right, so you create a new message, and rooms show. Right, so this is the view that correlates with the view of the room. Right, so this view right here is the room. So this is room show, and you see a form 4. Right, so it creates a new message and instantiates that message here. It uses remote true, except it ensures that there's a current user. So if you try to access without having actually signed in, it won't let you send a request. You'll see here, if current user, go ahead and display the current user's name. All right, so this is the form to actually send out the message. And then here it uses a partial, so it renders the messages. What does that partial look like? Well, let's take a look. Right, very simple. It shows the username, it shows the body, it shows the IP address, and then it says, the Rails helper time ago in words, messages updated at, and that corresponds to this section here. So this is one message. It uses a partial to render that. It makes sense. IP address, and we have some timestamps here. All that makes sense. So this is what it looks like. So right now, we only get messages if you refresh the page. But if I send my own message, it'll right away it immediately gets appended, Immediately gets appended. And how does that work? Well, the request comes to messages controller. It comes to create, And we said in our view, remote true, So that means it's not going to use the HTML response, but it's going to use a JavaScript response, So it'll go through, it'll create the message for us using the message parameters. It'll add in the IP address, adds in the username, and then it says format.js, So what is that? We expect to see that where, We expect to see a create.js file, and we see that here, create.js.erb. So this is what gets returned to the client after you add a message. And you'll notice here it uses @message.persisted. So it ensures, it first checks to see if the message was saved on the server, If it was, great, go ahead and render the message using the partial, and then it looks at the input body, and that's where you type in the message, and it clears it out, So it lets you type in then a new message. If it doesn't get persisted, that means that there's some error that went on, and then at the top of the page will render a flash message, and it will show the error. And that is what gets returned to the client. Now this is an ERB, So the ERB gets executed first, and then the JavaScript gets returned to the client. And that's how the message automatically gets added in when you type it in yourself. But now let's start to see about if we could create a WebSocket. So we talked about channels, So we're going to create a channel. And a channel, remember, is like a unit of work. It's like a topic you want to subscribe to. So we want to subscribe to messages, So we want to say, if we create a channel of messages, you can subscribe to them, and you can get messages as they start to get published and created on the server. So we'll go ahead and create that. Great, so now we have a few things here. So we have messages channel. We also have a JavaScript file, which is the WebSocket on the JavaScript side. So it acts as that interface for the connection layer. So messages channel is our interface on the server side, and this one is our interface on the client side. One more thing is to note is when I ran this command, it modifies our routes. So this is our config routes file, something we've seen before. One thing you'll notice, it now adds in this line up here, mount ActionCable server. Essentially, WebSocket requests go to this route, and it knows how to handle it and routes it to the appropriate ActionCable area. So it's /cable. So for example, if I were to go there, /cable, it'll basically page not found because it's not set up to handle HTTP web requests.
Is that friends list, or is that like list of people in the channel, the room on the left? Is that set up right now with ActionCable already?
It is. So this right now is set up with ActionCable and WebSockets. So that's why it's dynamic.
So the code that you just showed, where you set up the route to /cable, can I see that? The route file.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we have something like that for WebSockets for the channel already?
We do. So you don't have to, for here you don't need multiple resources. Like here to specify your different routes, All WebSocket requests get routed to /cable. It's a one endpoint for all WebSocket requests, But ActionCable knows how to route that. So if we go to our channels, we'll go to App Channels. We'll notice there's two channels here. There's a message channel, which we just created, and accordingly it's blank, right? Just the bare bones prototype that we created. The Appearance channel handles the list of active users, and that one's already filled out. Right, so this one, if you subscribe to the Appearance channel, your requests come here, and here you see some basic functionality around appearing and disappearing. So it tells the front end either a new user joined in to show them, or a user logged off, go ahead and make them disappear from the front end. But what's nice about ActionCable is you don't need to specify like cable, messages, any of that. /cable is the one endpoint that handles all of the WebSocket requests. A good question. So this is what gets added in when you run Rails generate channel, right? It'll start to add in ActionCable for us. And if you go there, it won't actually do anything because it's meant to handle not HTTP but a WebSocket request. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. You see that WebSocket? So there's also this WebSocket. There's also WebSocket Secure, which is WSS. Right? There's WebSocket Secure, and there's also WebSocket. One is just encrypted, and one's not. So if you are curious, you can read about the different ways of doing it. Right? WebSocket Secure, WebSocket. But the requests are sent via that protocol to /cable, which is why you really can't access it from the browser. But you'll notice in the logs, if we go back to our server logs, we have Appearance channel, right? That handles our list of active users. That's transmitting messages when people show up or people disappear. And you notice that it hits that endpoint, right? Started get /cable. So this is when someone is logging in, they're registering to that channel, they're creating a subscription. So they hit the request and saying, register me as someone who needs to receive messages. And then from that point on, it'll transmit and it'll send in messages. In this case, it's transmitting HTML, which you can see here. Great. So now that we've actually, we ran Rails generate channel messages. We have our channel. Let's start to see how the channels get created. So we have, so this is our messages.js file. And this sits at app assets javascript /channel/messages. And this is our interface to WebSockets from the front end. Right now we have just very basic, boilerplate code. Let's start to see how this works. So we'll add in some debug statements to kind of see how this is being called. So we'll say here connected. We'll do the same. And finally, when we receive data, we'd like to know what we're receiving. Great. So we'll open up the console here. And if we reload the page, we'll start to see, great, so it's connecting us to the subscription appearance. It's also subscribing us to the messages channel. And we'll see that we're connected here. And it starts to receive stuff from the appearance as people either log on or start to leave. Right, and so every time we refresh the page, it goes ahead and connects us to the channel, which is kind of nice that ActionCable takes care of a lot of the infrastructure for us. It makes it easy to work with in Rails. So if we have the channel set up, now let's start to connect to topics. So we have our messages channel, and right now we're connected. We're not actually going to receive any information because we're not getting streams yet. So the way we call this in Rails is we stream from, and we say some channel. So we're going to say we stream from the room channel. Right? We essentially want to get all the messages that belong to a room. And so we say we stream to the room channel, and over time we can start to publish messages to this room channel. So we have subscribed here, we have unsubscribed. These are both set up and tear down setup and tear down methods. We can define whatever method we want. So we can just say hi, right? Just some simple method. And what should it do? Well, if we look at the appearance channel, we'll start to see that it calls actioncable.server.broadcast. And that's how you send a message from the server. It says broadcast a message, And you notice here that it streams from the topic appearance. So it uses the same terminology here. It'll stream it to that channel. So let's go ahead and just do something basic. So we want to say stream it to the room, whichever one is there. And what should the payload be? We'll just say hello. Right? So we're going to say that message and take it down. So now if we go ahead and refresh the page, let's see if we can actually go ahead and call that. So we have access to app. And within app, we have different WebSockets. And I'm actually going to clear out some of these messages. We don't need all these messages. Okay. Great. So we have app, which is our object for ActionCable. It gets exposed to the front end, so we can ask for messages, and we can see the messages object. So we have app messages, and you start to see here. Here's our subscription that we get back. Right, it represents our communication between the client and the server. And you will see here in the subscription we have a connected function with the consumer with the URL, and it takes us to /cable, and it uses our WebSocket protocol. There's also the connection. Right, the connection we said was the underlying physical connection between the client and the server. We don't have to worry about that. Disconnected identifier, and so we had defined here say hi, right, as a function. So we can say app.messages.perform, and we can say hi. And you notice that it says true, which means good. And then we started to receive some data. So we received some data, and what data did we get? Well, we got say hello. And where did that data come from? Well, it came from here. Right? We sent out a message with the payload say hello, and then on the JavaScript side, we are listening to messages received, right? And we say, oh, great, we got some message back from the server, and we printed it out. And what was that message? Well, just say hello, right? But here we did go ahead and send a request to the server, and the server went ahead and broadcasted the message to everyone who subscribed to that channel. So this is our very first case of actually using WebSockets, right? We triggered on the server a broadcast, and the broadcast broadcasted out to all the clients the message say hello. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's a very basic example, but it starts to show that we're sending a message from the server to the client. Right? We call it again, similar thing. The set message is sent from the server to the client, and it's a separate request, right? So this request to actually trigger the message, we got back true because the message went through, and then an independent request was the actual receiving of the data back from the server. Right? It's not the same request. It's a different request that came back from the server. So now let's start to see if we can, rather than trigger it this way, actually trigger it from the front end. So we go to our messages, and you see here we have connected, disconnected, and received. We can also start to call. We can also start to create our own functionality. So if we wanted to, we could create a function like this. Say hi, and what would it do? Well, it would essentially call this .perform, right? Similar to how we just call on the front end. And it would say, say hi. So if we do that, now we can call, right before we called app.messages.perform, now we can just call app.messages.sayhi, and it'll do the same thing. So that's the function, and if we call it, right, it'll do the same thing. We're starting to now define functions that can do these things for us. So we've done say hi, but now let's make something actually interesting to us. Right, let's go ahead and say, let's create a function to send a message, to create a message and send it to the server. And what would that look like? Well, it probably would take in some data. Oops. And we're going to trigger some message, and that'll call the server, and it'll call the server, create message, and it'll send that data. Great. So if we now were to call this function create message, it'll send a request to ActionCable to create message. So we have to define that. So we have our messages channel, and we're going to find now a create message function, right? And this will get called by this line here, right? Create a message, call it, perform, great, it'll get here. And what do we want to do? Well, for now, let's go ahead and broadcast a message saying that we got something. So we'll broadcast it to the room, and we'll just send out the data that we get. We'll just kind of say, we'll trigger it right back and send it out to everyone and see what happens. So if we refresh, Great, we're connected. So we said, right, app.messages. What goes here now? Before we said, say hi. Now we can go ahead and say create message. And what's the message? Let's add some information. We'll say the body. You guys see that? The body is just hello world. Oh, looks like we sent it, but we did not get anything back. So let's see here. We have ActionCable.server.broadcast. Room, message, data. We didn't take it in our functionality here. Let's try it again. Let's just check the server logs. Undefined method, hello to you. Great, there we go. So we send out our message, the body, hello world. It looks like someone else is trying to send out a different message here, I think. Where is the error? Okay, I won't. Nice, those of you following along on your laptops. Received a message, right? And someone sent out just a message to us, hello to you. Nice. And the message we sent out was hello world, right? So we sent out a simple message, app.messages.create message, and it had some information, and it responded back to us, right? So again, not too complex yet, but we're sending a message to the server, and the server is then broadcasting that to everyone. And someone else sent this message, and we got it, which is great. And right, just a few lines of code. And so what did we do? Right, we had our function on the JavaScript side, right, and this is our messages on JavaScript to trigger a call to the server. Then the server goes ahead and handles that. And for now, all it does is it responds back and it broadcasts that message to all the users. Great. So that means that we've started to actually send data. So now that the data comes back to the client, right, we're getting the data on the client side, we should show the data, right? We should update the view with that data. So what would that look like? So this again, right, is our app channel or app assets JavaScript's channel messages. And let me just show that path to you. So that file, right, is at app assets JavaScript, and we go to the channels folder, and in channels we have messages.js. So messages.js is this file. It handles all of our information back and forth for WebSockets. So here we have received, and this function receives data from the server. So we receive data, but let's actually start to do something with it. So maybe we can update the view to show the data. And what we're going to show, let's just show the div class messages, class message, and then we'll say data.message.body, and then we'll close off our div. Right, so we're getting some data. We're assuming it has a structure that looks like data.message.body, and that's what we've sent. And so we'll go ahead and add it to the view, and let's just ensure that we're calling that right. So we'll go to room show, and we have here div class messages. Great. Thank you. You guys are quick. Great. So now if I call message, great, I start to see it pop up, right? So if we start to send messages, right, we trigger them through JavaScript, hello world 2, right? We're starting to see some messages show up. So what we've done so far, right? We've created a function on JavaScript to send a request to the server. Someone's having some fun here. We sent the message, broadcast it out to all the users, and then we showed it after we got it back. We showed it on the front end, right? So that's pretty cool. But we still have some work to do because we actually haven't, used any view to render this. We're kind of just doing this in a basic div. It's not very fancy. So let's start to kind of make this a little better. So one thing to note here is we're currently using a form for, right? And this is something we've seen before. And the form form takes us to the messages controller, right? Stuff we've seen before. It takes us to messages controller, and it takes us to create. And that's great when I create, a simple object. It hits create, it creates it, responds with some JavaScript, with some HTML. But if you use ActionCable, there's a different way that's recommended to do things. Rather than start using messages controller, because the connection is kept open for the entire lifespan, you start to want to use the messages channel, and the channel becomes a way to interface with the front end. So the front end starts to send requests to the channel, and it gets back webhook notifications through this channel. So we're actually in that spirit going to comment out this form 4. And I think I'll just remove it like that. And instead, we're going to define our own input. So we're going to say input, and it's going to be type text, and we're going to make it message body. That, and maybe we'll put like a placeholder. So if we refresh, right, we removed our fancy UI, but we also removed the form 4. And now we have a basic message. So we have a message right now, but nothing happens. So we want to listen to it. We can define an onChange, right? This is an onChange functionality. And we can say onChange, go ahead and create message. Well, where's create message defined? It's not defined yet, but where should we define it? Remember in the beginning, when we set up jQuery, we had to modify our application.js. There's a line here that says require tree. Essentially, it adds in any file under in the JavaScript folder. So we have app, assets, JavaScripts. We have a bunch of files here. I don't know if you guys can see those. Application, cable, messages, rooms. Right? All of these are included because of require tree. If you wanted to have a folder, you could say require like messages. Right? It requires the messages folder. But we're going to define this in rooms.js because this is right. It makes sense. We're talking about rooms. We're showing rooms. So we have here right our input. We have onChange create message. So we'll go ahead and define that, and we'll say create message function create message, and we'll take an event. And for now, we'll just go ahead and output it. Create message and event. So let's see here. If we type in something with onChange, though, we actually have to click outside of the box. We can't just type in things. And so here we get create message, and we get undefined. We take in a parameter, but nothing is being passed in. So we'll go ahead and pass in this, and we'll try again. So we type in some text, and now we get create message. So our JavaScript was properly executed. What we get here is the element, which isn't very useful, right? I typed in a bunch of text, and I want to really get the text and send that to the server. I don't really care right now about the element. So what we want to do is change that. We also want to get it so that every time I type in a key, it updates, as opposed to having to click outside. So I believe we can do on key up. Let's try that. So now, great, I'm starting to get some messages, starting to get some information. But it's still, again, it's the actual element and not the text. So let's go ahead and use some JavaScript to get that. So we have here text, placeholder, name. We'll go ahead and define an ID, message body. And then in here, we can start to say, all right, when the document loads, right, use some jQuery, on, and we use in the gem file something called turbo links. How many of you are familiar with turbo links? I've used it before. Okay, so this one. So let me show that really quickly. Turbo links. I can type it in. It essentially makes navigating your web pages easier. I'd recommend checking it out and using it. So it's really beneficial for single page applications. Rather than having to refresh an entire page, it speeds up the cost of transitions. So it's worth checking out. Highly recommend it. So we want to know when the page loads, though. So we're going to ask for turbo links load, and that's an event. And when that happens, we're going to define a function. Right? And so what's the function going to be? Well, we're going to say message body, right? And that is our message body, right? This input. We're going to go ahead and ask the message body, and we'll say what on key up. Let's go ahead and define a function, and we'll take the event. And I can print out the event, right? And let's just see what happens. So we have our chat, refresh. We start to type in, and now we're getting key up, right? So every time we type, now we're getting an event. This is great. And if you look here, we can start to inspect some of the information on this actual event. It's just the jQuery user event. So when you type in a key, this is what we get. And you'll notice here we get the key, which is the actual key we pressed. We also get some key code. We get timestamp. We get a whole bunch of information. What I really care about, though, is when user presses enter. So let's see if we can find that. So we have the event, and we have the key code. So let's see if we can just print out the key code. Oops. Great. And so now when I type, we get the key code. If I press enter, we see key code 13. So that's fantastic. So if I say if event.keycode is 13, right, we'll go ahead and do something. And what should we do? Well, we should probably say something like, submitting message. User pressed enter. Let's go ahead and submit the message. What message should we send? Well, we probably want some data. And what should the data look like? Well, we'll probably have a body. And we need to get the value now from the field. And this is the JavaScript way to kind of, the jQuery way to ask for the event that we just got. JavaScript is pretty complex. Sometimes comes to scope and this. So definitely read up on it if you're not familiar with it. But we'll ask for the data, and then we'll send it to the server. And how do we send it to the server? Well, we've seen this before, right? We typed it in the console, app.messages.createMessage. And we're actually just going to send just the data over as is. One thing to note on the side is I'm using const here as opposed to var. You also could use let. Who's familiar with the differences between all of these? Say it again. So we'll start with ES6. var is actually no longer recommended because the scope can be quite complex. So I do actually recommend reading up on it if you're curious. Actually, const versus var. There's a good guide. This is written by a guy who does a lot of JavaScript maintenance. Worth checking out, but he kind of covers how to use the differences between var, let, or const. So worth checking out this one. But essentially, since it's a data structure that's not changing, we go ahead and use const. But we have here our body. We send it. We'll go ahead and print out the message as well. Final thing we need to do is clear out our field. So we'll set the field to be blank. Great. Thanks. So we're connected. That's great. Fantastic. Let's see if we type in test message. Right. Great. We said we're connected. We submitted the message, and we send up an action and a body, and we got the data back. And we noticed it got appended, right? Because we have already set up how to handle data back. And if we look at the server logs, we'll start to see. It looks like someone tried to access it without logging in. There's a lot going on here. So let's go ahead and print out some messages. So create message will rails.logger.info. Inspect, and make that create underscore message. And then here, we have our log, right, which is running here, but it has a lot of information. I care just about the create message, so I'll ask just for that. So I'll ask my development logs, and I'll grep for create message. Cool. So cool. So we got the data back. It's appended, and we'll see here in our log, messages channel. So it received the message, create message. It got the body. It has the body of the text that I typed in, and it also has the action to create message. And then went ahead and broadcasted it out to everyone, which is fantastic. So we have, to recap, right, we can type in now a message. Our JavaScript can pull that from the input field, send it to the server. The server can then go ahead and broadcast that back to everyone else. What are some problems with what we've done so far? What are some shortcomings? Any ideas? Exactly. So we didn't actually save it. We just send it out to everyone, but it's not persisted. It definitely looks ugly, right? We have yet to incorporate the UI, so we want to make sure we start adding in and using the partial. We're also missing the username, right? Like some people were sending messages earlier and we getting messages back. We don't quite know yet who was sending that to us. We just know that a message was sent. But since we have people logged in and we have a concept of a username, we really should send that out. Thanks, guys. We really should send that out and start to know that who's actually sending out this message. So let's start to make it look nice and add in some database persistence. So when we receive the message back, right now we're kind of just displaying it as is, which is very basic. Instead, let's go ahead and show the message. So we say let's ask for the data.message, and we ask for a rendered, which is something we'll define. We could say .html or .content, but we'll stick with rendered for now. And so when we send out that, right, we go to our channel, and right now we're sending out just message data. And what is data? Data is just the data we get back from the data we send in, right? So we send in some data, it has a body, and we send that right back out to everyone. It's very basic. But let's see if we start to send out some data. And we probably want to define a rendered and have it include some information, right? So we can show that on the front end. And we're actually now need to start saving this. So we're going to create our message. And we're going to say message params, keep this consistent. And then we'll go ahead and define the input as message params. So we say at messages message params. We have data, right? We need to kind of put some information here so that we know what to do. If at message, save. Find data outside of this as well. So if we save the message, we have something rendered. And what do we want to do? So we have here a concept of a partial, right, which we talked about before. And so essentially we want to return this partial as HTML to the front end. The front end can start to show it. And how do we do that? Let me close this here. Let me open up the Rails console and do that. So they extracted out the partial, and you can ask for it in application controller. You can ask for it dot render. So you can ask it to render just a subsection, and you'll see here that there's undefined method empty, so it's looking for some information which we have yet to pass in. So we'll ask for a partial, and the partial should be messages message, and that sort of partial messages / message is fine here. Great, so we'll pass it in as our partial, and then we need to pass in the information, so the actual message that we want to care about. So we pass in locals, and it needs the information. So here's message. For now, let's just see what it looks like. So we say message.last, and I'm missing a comma. Cool. And you'll see here that it actually returns to us our div, our HTML, which is the partial, with the right information. So this seems handy. So it seems like we should want to use this to return back the information to the front end. So I'm going to find a method here, render message. And we'll go ahead and call that accept message.last. Now we actually want to render the message that we just created. So we'll render message. And here, rendered, right? What should this be? Well, this is just render message at message. Right, so we're going to create our message. We'll go ahead and save it. If we actually can save it, we'll pass back some data, and we'll pass it back under a rendered key. And the rendered key just contains all of our information that is HTML. So let's go ahead and refresh. It looks like we submitted and we didn't get anything back. Let's check out our server error logs actually. I'm going to grep it again. Let's see if we can find our logs. Okay, so looks like we sent the message, but it didn't actually go through because we didn't get anything back from the right. So we submitted, we got nothing back. So let's see if we can inspect our messages. Here we have create message. It's not very helpful. Let's see if we can find our error logs. So many of you on here. Create message. Okay. So we have messages channel, create message. It looks like it's not actually trying to save anything. Let's see. Create message. Message.new, message params. So it looks like it didn't save. Right? We can probably print out something here. Rails.logger.error. No, right. Or maybe we can actually here. Let's do it this way. We'll make it so that the client can right. If we have an error, we should probably show that. So rendered equals some information about that. So we'll say at message.errors.full messages to sentence. I'll wait for it to refresh. Dang. What did I just do? Undefined local variable method data. Oh, here. There we go. That was our problem. Cool. Looks like we found our bug, but we have not yet found our refresh bug. I'm going to kill the server. Start over. All right. So here we go. We submitted our message, but we got nothing back. Let's inspect our logs. Expecting to see an error message. Not. Huh. Oh, here we go. Here's our message. Unknown attribute action. So if we look at the data, we'll say here create message, and we'll also look at the message params. So we look at the message params, which we have here, and it looks like we had create message with message params is this, and it tried to pass action into message.new, and it threw an error. Right, so in this section. So remember how in the controllers we had dot permit and we had certain fields we allowed through, right? We would say dot require, like a message, and then we would say dot permit, right? Remember in the controller. So we can also just whitelist certain things. So we can ask for the body. We also eventually want the username, so we'll go ahead and ask for that. So now if we go ahead and clear out this error message queue, we'll refresh, and we submitted the message, and what did we get? Runtime error, unable to find channel with identifier. Huh. Messages channel. Let's see. Messages channel. Create message. And perform action. Let's see, we have messages channel here, create message. Ah, thank you. Cool, cool. All right, take 3. Great. So now at least we're getting a response back. Room must exist, body can't be blank, and username can't be blank. So it looks like we have a bunch of errors, and we're not actually passing in any information that we need. So let's see here. We'll go ahead. So our request had body, but no username. And it also looks like it has body as a string and not a symbol. So I think I got to do body username. And we need a username. So when we create our message that is on the front end, right, we have here create message data, and that is being created from the JavaScript. So when we create our message, we have data. We'll go ahead and for now define a username, and we'll just say guest. So we at least have a concept of a username. And let's see if we can, great. So now the problem is the room must exist. We've yet to define the room. So we're in room 3. So for now, let's just go ahead and in the channel, we'll just hard code that in. Let's see if we get the message to show up. Great. So now the message is starting to show up. So what did we do? Right? We have our messages channel, which listens in for requests through this function. It takes the message, it goes ahead and creates it, it saves it, and then it renders back using this partial, the message in the partial form, right? And the message now starts to show up here, right? Which is great. So we can send some messages, it starts to show up, and hopefully you guys, if you refresh your page, you should be seeing this on your laptops as well. Starting to see some things coming. Yeah, it's also a good spot for a break. So we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back.